Hello ladies and gentlemen, what is going on? It is Lake here, and today I'm going to be teaching you guys a bit of biochemistry. It's a new series I'm starting, just a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of biology, a little bit of physics, a little bit of math, all on this channel. So yes, this is the first episode of biochemistry, learning about macromolecules, saccharides, stuff like that. So let's get right into it. First of all, we got organic compounds. The definition of an organic compound is something that contains carbon atoms. Now, most living matter here on Earth is organic, which means it has carbon in it. An example of this is CHH12O6, which is glucose, or our DNA, or CO2 gas, which is also known as carbon dioxide. Now, an inorganic compound, most of the time, does not contain carbon. There are some exceptions, and we'll get to that in a later video. Alright, moving on now, we have what is carbon? Carbon is the basis for all living life on Earth right now. And carbon is something that bonds very, very, very frequently with itself and with other things, and that's why it's such a common bonding thing, I guess, common element to bond with. And the bonds the carbon has are covalent bonds. And in a covalent bond, they share electrons. So as you can see here, there's a single bond. Hold on, let me get this. There is a single bond where it shares one pair of electrons. There is a double bond where it shares two pairs of electrons, and then there is a triple bond where it shares three. And you can see here, there's a single, there's a double, and there is a triple. Okay. Moving on. Now we have large carbon molecules. They are divided into three different types of molecules. First of all, we have a monomer, which are the smallest and the most simple, and it seems pretty easy. Yeah, they're pretty easy to remember. Then there's the polymers, which are molecules that are made of repeated links. As you can see, that is the polymer on the bottom, and monomers linking to form polymers is called a condensation reaction. So let me just get up my pointer finger here. You can see here is a monomer, and here is another monomer, and they link together to form this larger polymer. So that is a condensation reaction. Very interesting. So moving on now, here is an example again of a condensation reaction. This is an amino acid, and this is an amino acid, and they form a peptide bond, which we'll be talking about later in this episode. So yeah, so far we've covered carbon molecules, functional groups, hydrophilic, we will get to that in a second, carbon, and organic compounds. That's what we covered so far, just a little review. And lastly, we have ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. It is the supply of energy for all of our cells. And some examples of ATP at work are in our fascicles and our muscles, in cellular respiration, which turns glucose and oxygen into 6 molecules of H2O and CO2 and produces more ATP. In active transport through the phospholipid bilayer of our cell membranes. Those are all examples of ATP being used in our cell, or in our body. Okay, next up we are going to be covering macromolecules. These are the big guys, which include carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Okay. So first up, we got carbohydrates. So these are monosaccharides, or simple sugars, that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And the monosaccharides vary in structure but have the same chemical makeup. So what I mean by this is, like you see here, C6H12O6, that is glucose. And glucose is one of the most simple sugars we have here on planet Earth. It's used for numerous amounts of different things for humans and for other organisms, and it follows this same 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Now the formula that this has is kind of, it's a C1, so just imagine this, C1H2O1, and then there's a little n, and the n stands for any number that you can multiply, and it will always be in this. Like if it was let's say we have, I don't think that I can write on this, but if I could, I would. Let's say we have like C1, H2O1, and then times 3, we will have 3 carbon, we will have 6 hydrogen, and we will have 3 oxygen, so same 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, simple sugars. These are carbohydrates, and they include disaccharides, which are 2 monosaccharides linking. And remember what a monosaccharide is. Do I not have monosaccharides? Oh, here we go. Then we have polysaccharides, which are 3 or more monosaccharides linking together. And here we cover 2 very basic forms of polysaccharide or monosaccharides, which are glucose and fructose. And glucose is, as I said earlier, the main source of energy for our cells. And in humans, it is stored in polysaccharides known as glycogen, and in plants, it is stored as starch. And fructose is found in fruits, is what the fruits produce. All right, moving on to the next slide. Proteins. Proteins are mainly made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Nitrogen is the important one here because it's different than anything else, and that's why we need nitrogen. The air is actually 74% nitrogen, and there is what we use it for, right here, making proteins. So proteins are made of from linked monomers called amino acids, and the amino acids form a bunch of peptide bonds, which essentially just link 2 amino acids together to form bigger things. And here is an example of an amino acid right here. This is not a dipeptide or polypeptide. This is a single amino acid. So essentially there are 4 different parts of an amino acid. You have the central carbon right here, which is either single or double bond to the amino group, and the carboxyl group. Now this is usually the same. This has some variance, but the R group is where the big changes happen. The R can be anything that's organic and not organic, that is not a cation, but is like something basic, like any of these molecules, and the R is where it really changes. And you can see that. And again, all these bonds are covalent. Okay, so some more proteins include enzymes, which are molecules that act as catalysts. And if we're going to get into an enzyme a little bit, we can go to this slide right here, and I can describe what's happening on the other side here. So essentially here, we have what's called the active site. And what the active site does, it is the enzyme. Then here we have the substrate, which is the substance that is being acted, the enzyme is acting onto. And so you see this enzyme, it is little folds, and in the little folds is where the actual reaction speeding up takes place. And so this is what it looks like when it's reacting with the substrate. And what's happening right now is the enzyme its bonds are weakening, which helps the substrate get the catalyzation that it needs. And I haven't mentioned it, but a catalyst is anything that speeds up a chemical reaction. So yes, after the reaction, the enzyme remains unchanged, which is pretty awesome, if you ask me. So they can be overused over and over again until eventually they die, as is everything in our body. Okay. So next we have lipids, the wonderful thing called lipids. Lipids are large organic molecules, which mainly consist of fatty acids, triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, waxes, and pigments. But in this segment, we are not going to be covering pigments. So first of all, we're going to be covering fatty acids are large strings of carbon that make up most lipids. And there are 2 different types of fatty acids. There is saturated, and then there's unsaturated. So saturated includes carbon atoms that are bonded fully, and unsaturated means that they form double bonds, so they're not bonded fully. Moving on, sorry if that was a little bit unclear. Triglycerides are 3 molecules of fatty acids joined with 1 molecule of glycerol. and this includes butter and fat. So here are the fatty acids right here, and here's the glycerol, and they are bonded together. Those are the long ones, and those are pretty short compared to these long fatty acid chains. Keep in mind, this is just carbon and hydrogen and oxygen that are making up this. This is like a long string of carbon, then there's like hydrogen and oxygen on each side, and the glycerol kind of the same way. That's like a pretty, you get that carbon, and they're bonded into other things. So phospholipids, this is a cool one because they are used so much in cellular biology. It's amazing. There is hydrophilic, and then there is hydrophobic. And there's a hydrophilic head to the phospholipid, and then there's a hydrophobic tail. And what that means is the hydrophilic means it loves water, and the hydrophobic means that it fears water. It doesn't like water. And that is really useful because we have a phospholipid bilayer on the membrane of all of our cells, and this is polar, which means it is a slight charge, and this is nonpolar, which means it doesn't have a charge. And so this right here is going to be hydrophilic, which means it loves water, which means that things can easily be consumed by the cell and taken out by the cell, and through exocytosis, I think it's called. And yes, so that's how we can get things so easily into our cell, and it creates a lipid bilayer in the cell membrane. So, lastly, I believe we have steroids, which are 4 fused carbon rings with various functional groups attached. And steroids, really interestingly, make a bunch of different hormones. Testosterone in males, or also known as androgens in males. There is also progesterone and progesterone. You can see there's progesterone right there, and big female hormone, and then there's testosterone. And by the way, women have testosterone, a very slight amount, and men also do have estrogen and progesterone. And cortisol, you can see the stress hormone. Hormones fascinate me. Can't wait till we get to the endocrine system. So, yes. Oh, lastly, we have waxes, and waxes are long fatty acid chains joined with a long alcohol chain. We're going to get into alcohol later as well. And they are secreted in animals to help waterproof things, like our earwax. It helps water from not getting into our ears. That's why we have earwax. Okay, last but not least, we have nucleic acids. Now, these are what make us up. Excuse me. They are large, and they're very complicated, and they store everything, any very important information about us. So the name for the 2 major types of nucleic acids are deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA, and there is ribonucleic acid, also known as RNA. So deoxyribonucleic acid determines the characteristics of an organism, while ribonucleic acid manufactures the proteins. So deoxyribonucleic acid translates into RNA, which then turns into proteins, which then build up us. So, yeah. That is actually the presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something, maybe. Hopefully it wasn't too boring for you all, because I know this is fascinating to me. So if you enjoyed, please leave a comment, and if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I appreciate your time, and good luck on the test you have.